A North Carolina woman is now charged in the death of her 9-month-old daughter after allegedly telling first responders it was a mercy killing.
To me, when I see something like that, that would be very concerning to me, and I would think that the patient is probably psychotic.
According to reports, the woman told investigators God made her do it. So is it a completely criminal case, or could there be an underlying mental health issue?
Postpartum psychosis is really the most extreme form, and that happens probably to about 1 in 1,000 women.
The case takes place in Hickory, North Carolina, about an hour northwest of Charlotte. In the early morning hours of July 12th, first responders there got a call for an adult female who seemed disoriented. The woman was later identified as 39-year-old Megan Stack Sattizahn. I asked forensic psychiatrist Dr. Daniel Bober about this. Originally, a call comes in for a suspicious person who's walking around this neighborhood, kind of acting a little strange, potentially, according to some reports, not wearing any clothing. So is this a sign that something is off, that she's wandering around at about 5 o'clock in the morning, not wearing clothes?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a patient I see in the ER probably twice a week. I mean, yes, we have patients that come in all the time, psychotic, wandering around without their clothes on, running down the highway. So, yes, to me, when I see something like that, that would be very concerning to me. And I would think that the patient is probably psychotic, whether it be from pregnancy or drug induced. But yes, that would be something that's very significant.
First responders followed Sattizahn for nearly a mile as she walked toward her home. When they questioned her, she said, quote, "Everyone come in, the baby is dead." Inside the home, investigators found the body of 9-month-old Samantha Sattizahn. So with this specific story, to me, I'm thinking postpartum depression, potentially postpartum psychosis. Is that what's jumping into your head too?
You know, it's very interesting. When I saw this case, it did remind me a lot of Andrea Yates, which was a case of postpartum psychosis. And her defense used this, what we call altruistic filicide. Now, filicide is the killing of a child by a parent or step parent.
The Andrea Yates case gained national attention in 2001 when the stay-at-home mom killed all 5 of her children by drowning them in the bathtub. After that, she called 911 repeatedly. In 2002, Yates was tried and found guilty of capital murder. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. But shortly after that, Yates's verdict was appealed. She was retried in 2006 and found not guilty by reason of insanity. Dr. Bober says the Yates case has similarities to Sattizahn's.
Andrea Yates basically killed her children to prevent them from going to hell. So, in other words, she killed them for a psychotic reason. It wasn't based in reality. And the defense said that she did it in a sense to help them. And so when I see this case, it reminds me of that, because the most common type of filicide, or killing of a child by a parent, is usually because the child is unwanted. But another type of filicide is called the altruistic filicide. It's also was used by Susan Smith, who killed her child because she said that she was going to kill herself afterwards. But the prosecution basically said it was because she wanted to be with another man, and the man didn't accept her for her children. So this definitely reminds me of cases that are high profile from the past.
Dr. Bober says it's too soon to diagnose Sattizahn, but the case does have elements of a severe mental health issue. When we're talking about postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis, am I correct in saying that psychosis is the most severe kind and relatively rare?
Yes, so maybe 2 or 3 women out of 10 experience what we call the blues in pregnancy, and that generally occurs because of hormonal changes. It's actually very common. And then probably about 1 in 100 experience postpartum depression. So this is depression that's really affecting their daily functioning. It may cause changes in their sleep, their weight, their self-care, their hygiene, they're sad, they're hopeless. That's postpartum depression. And then postpartum psychosis is really the most extreme form. And that happens probably to about 1 in 1,000 women. And then you get what the Andrea Yates type situation where she killed her children. So it's a very significant disorder. It's something that I think society really puts a lot of pressure on women, especially new moms. They're supposed to be bright and happy and cheerful. And there are definitely some physiological changes that go on, and they have a lot on their plate. So sometimes I think society can be very unforgiving about those types of things being a new mom is one of the toughest jobs there is.
After investigators found the body of baby Samantha, her mother made a shocking confession. And when investigators do get to her home, she apparently tells them that her daughter has been killed and she did it. She said that it was a mercy killing and that God told her to. What do you make of that?
Almost identical to Andrea Yates. Now, in her particular case, that defense did not work. In the state of North Carolina, where this crime occurred, they used the McNaughton rule. So we're looking at two things. We're looking at, did the person understand the nature and quality of their act? Did they know what they were doing? And then the second part of it, which is, could they distinguish between right and wrong? And you can be very sure that her defense will hire an expert and that there will be an expert on the prosecution side, and it will be a battle of the experts, essentially.
Sattizahn was taken into custody, but first taken to the hospital. Her charges didn't come until a week later. And we know that originally she was taken into medical care. She was evaluated for her mental health status, and it wasn't until about a week later that she was charged. So during that time, do you expect that medical experts said that she was clear and had done this of her own volition rather than it being some sort of postpartum psychosis?
So, a lot of experts believe that postpartum psychosis is bipolar disorder until proven otherwise. So, it would be interesting to know her mental health history. Had she seen a psychiatrist previously? Did she have a history of what we call manic episodes or exacerbations of bipolar disorder? We need to know a lot more about her history before we judge her on what happened during those events.
If we're talking about her history, according to some reports, there was a past attempt to kill her young baby. This was in December 2023, so several months ago, and apparently she had tried to kill the young girl then. Is that a major red flag?
That is an absolutely major red flag. In fact, Andrea Yates had prior episodes of psychosis prior to the event where she killed her five children, and her doctor actually told her, I do not recommend that you have any more children because this is likely to occur again. So I would ask, who knew that information? Did her doctor know that information? Did her family know that information? Because it would seem to me that if someone knew that information, it would be quite negligent of them to leave her alone with her child, knowing that there had been this prior incident.
As Dr. Bober explains, there's a specific timetable for postpartum depression or psychosis. Now, explain this to me a bit, because usually when we're talking about postpartum depression and psychosis, it's with a woman who has just given birth within the recent past, 1 year or so. So is it possible that she could have this sort of psychosis years later, or is it just the hormones released after giving birth?
So years later would be a little bit late to call it postpartum psychosis. Usually it occurs closer to the time of giving birth, or what we call, you don't actually use the term postpartum psychosis. I mean, we might say peripartum, so around the time of pregnancy or giving birth. But years later, it would probably be a separate and distinct disorder, whether that would be bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or something of the like.
Okay, that is interesting because there are also previous reports that this same defendant back in 2017 had an issue with her older daughter, who was 8 years old at the time. So, kind of out of this realm or
A
timeline of
window.
just giving birth. Yes, exactly, the window. And she disappeared. Investigators were worried about the mother, they were worried about the daughter. So, that kind of is a question mark to me. That has something completely separate to do with this postpartum. What do you think?
Right. So, where was the family? Where were her doctors? Where were child protective services? If they knew that this prior history existed, you would think that they would want to try to put safeguards in place to prevent this from happening again. So, that is very concerning.
That incident happened 7 years before the death of 9-month-old Samantha. Dr. Bober says it's possible Sattazahn's symptoms subsided during that interim time, or that she was receiving treatment. So let's say that she was under treatment if she was going to therapy or receiving some sort of drugs to assist in all of this, and then she stops doing those things. Is that something that investigators will point to as a trigger, so to speak?
So that's actually one of the most difficult challenges we face in the field of psychiatry and mental health. When we have a woman, for example, who wants to have a child and she's taking medication, and we know that she is stable on that medication, and we know that the pregnancy itself could exacerbate her symptoms, we usually sit down with them and we go over the medications and we look at the risks versus the benefits of staying on medication, because obviously there's a risk to the unborn child of being on psychiatric medication. It also can pass into breast milk. But then there's the risk of being pregnant and having untreated mental illness. So this is something that we really would look at and sit down and try to talk to the patient about before she had a child.
And speaking about her medical history, there's actually been a search warrant for her medical records. So investigators, prosecutors are kind of combing through those now as we speak. What sort of things would they be looking for?
So again, had she visited the emergency room? Was she under the influence of any substances? Did she have a history of being treated for drug or alcohol problems? Any prior contacts with the mental health care system, whether it be outpatient psychiatric treatment or inpatient psychiatric treatment? These are all things we would want to look at. We'd also want to talk to the people that knew her. Were there any events that occurred prior to the Sentinel event that would indicate that she was suffering from a mental health problem? Was she under any unusual amount of stress? Had there been any history of violence? These are all things we want to look at.
As for what's ahead in the case, there are still some unanswered questions. So far, we don't know how she died. Is that something that is going to be important, whether I know in the Andrea Yates case, she drowned her children, or in other cases, the Lindsay Clancy case, she's actually strangled her children with exercise bands? Does the way that the little girl was killed factor in at all?
So it would factor in for me in the amount of time it took. For example, stabbing someone with a knife or shooting them with a gun versus holding their head underwater or strangling them. These things take time. Some take more time than others. So I would really want to know how impulsive of an act it was or how it was planned out. I think that might play into the defense of this case.
In regards to her defense, what do you think that she could put forward, saying that she is experiencing these symptoms and potentially had a psychotic break?
So just because someone is psychotic doesn't mean that they're legally insane, as we know. But yes, if I was her defense attorney, that's exactly what I would be looking at. As we all know, the insanity defense is very rarely used and it's very rarely successful. But given these serious charges, they're going to have to look at all options. In the state of North Carolina, the burden of proof is on the defendant when they're claiming the insanity defense.
Dr. Bober says Sattizhahn's defense could reference some of the other monumental cases with details similar to her alleged crime. We've talked a lot about the Andrea Yates case. Do you think this is something that her defense attorneys will take a closer look at and kind of see what worked, what didn't work, and potentially apply it here?
I do. A lot of pioneering work was done by Dr. Philip Resnick, and he was actually the one who testified in the Andrea Yates case. So who knows? They may even call him as a consultant.
In the end, Dr. Bober says it's important to remember new mothers and their children need extra support.
I know this is something that we've seen a lot of times, and we've talked a lot about it on this network. And it just really shows that a lot of these women who are having children, they need more support than they're getting. And I think whether that's through family or mental health providers or child protective services, I think if there were more support in place and more safeguards, we could prevent some of these incidents from occurring.
Right now, Sattizahn is being held in jail and has so far been denied bond. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Sierra Gillespie.